The early days in the Johnson family. I'm Sarah Williams, though I was born Sarah Johnson, and for most of my life, I wore that name like a proud banner. I grew up in Cedar Creek, a small Texas town where everyone knows your business and the Johnson name opens most doors. Our family home was this sprawling white farmhouse, its porch always creaking, whether you stepped on it in the bright morning sun or tiptoed home late after a Friday night football game. Looking back now, my childhood seems like a movie from the golden age of Americana, but at the time, it was simply normal to me. The smell of pancakes on Sundays, the whir of the trucks rolling into the Johnson & Sons hardware warehouse before dawn, the tales my father told at the dinner table about hard deals and second chances. My father, Samuel Johnson, was larger than life, at least to me. Folks in Cedar Creek talked about him with equal parts respect and envy. He was a man who'd built something out of nothing when the odds weren't in his favor. He'd inherited barely more than a ramshackle storefront and a dream from my grandfather. But by the time I was old enough to count inventory, Johnson & Sons had grown into the heart of our community. People came to us for lumber, tools, a handshake, or sometimes just my mother's strong, sweet coffee while waiting for orders. The business was in my blood, whether I'd chosen it or not. From as early as 7, my tasks grew in tandem with my height. Stacking nails, stamping receipts, learning when to stay quiet and when to challenge. Always with Dad looking on, with that tough love twinkle in his pale blue eyes. Growing up in the Johnson household meant you learned early that family and business were sewn together with the same thick thread. My older brother Patrick was the natural heir, tall and steady with Dad's stubborn chin. I looked up to him as a kid. He was 5 years older and seemed to stride into every room like he owned it. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear my parents talking quietly about the future, about passing the baton one day, always said with a kind of hope wrapped in worry. But none of that felt real to me then. Back then, my world was simple. I'd race Patrick down the gravel driveway barefoot, dream about faraway cities, and sneak into Dad's office to touch the heavy ledgers, feeling the weight of what someday might be expected of me. Family gatherings were loud and warm, dinners stretching on as stories grew taller, and laughter filled the room. There was an unspoken rule: no matter what happened during the workday, a tough negotiation, a shipment delayed by rain, even disagreements over money, everything was set aside at the dinner table. My mother, Eleanor, saw to that with a steely grace. She'd worked just as hard as my father, only her labor wasn't measured in contracts signed, but in the peace she kept. The way she smoothed the rough edges we all brought home. Those early days felt unbreakable then. I thought loyalty was an unspoken law, something you could stack up like firewood for the winter. It never occurred to me that trust, once splintered, can prove impossible to fix. But that's another chapter. My father's faith in me. When I think about the turning point in my life, it always comes back to the moment my father, Charles Johnson, handed me the keys to his kingdom. Or at least, that's how it felt. I was 28, fresh out of business school in Chicago, and still clinging to the academic certainty that every business problem had a textbook solution. My father, a proud Texan with silver hair and a handshake that could crush granite, had run Johnson Hardware for over 3 decades. But now he said it was time for me to make my mark. Dad's trust was never given without reason. Growing up, he'd tested me in 100 small ways, from managing inventory during the spring rush to handling the payroll when the bookkeeper got the flu. He watched every move, not unkindly, but with a steely sort of expectation that I'd rise to challenges. That summer, surrounded by the sun-baked fields of East Texas and the hum of trucks rolling over gravel, I attended my first board meeting as the company's new chief operating officer. It should have been intimidating. Half the room was made up of men who'd known me since childhood. But Dad's nod of approval anchored me. It was like being handed the family compass and told not only to follow the map, but to redraw it where I saw fit. My older brother, Ben Johnson, was always the obvious heir. 6 years my senior, Ben possessed a natural charm and the kind of confidence that made him popular at church socials and business conventions alike. We never competed outright. Our personalities were too different, and Dad had always kept expectations clear. When Ben started pulling away from the business, distancing himself from family dinners, and coming home later and later, it left a vacuum. That's when Dad started encouraging me to spend more time in the office. We'd stay late, poring over ledgers by the glow of my father's battered desk lamp. He taught me more in those long evenings than any MBA professor ever could. The art of closing a deal, the skill in reading suppliers' eyes, the importance of honesty even when it hurt. I could tell it wasn't easy for my father to change course, even if he never said as much. His faith in me wasn't loud, but it was persistent. A job well done, acknowledged not with grand gestures, but a subtle smile or a hand on my shoulder. Still, there was always that lingering question of legacy. Was I living up to the Johnson name, or just occupying space until Ben changed his mind? Dad never admitted to worry, but sometimes I'd catch him glancing over old photographs or standing silently on the back porch, gripping the railings until his knuckles turned white. Earning Dad's trust was an ongoing process, not a singular event. With every mistake I made or decision I questioned, he let me learn, sometimes the hard way. When a supplier nearly duped us with subpar merchandise, he gave me the room to fix the problem myself, even though he could have solved it in minutes. His faith, I realized, was his greatest form of love and the heaviest responsibility I'd ever carry. Looking back now, I see those days as the foundation of everything that came next. The calm before the storm, and the last truly uncomplicated memories I have of our family business. The day everything changed. They say the ground never truly shakes until you least expect it. And for our family business, the earthquake came in the form of betrayal I could never have predicted, not from the outside world, but from within my own blood. I'd always believed that the thick Johnson ties, woven over decades through sweat, Sunday dinners, and 1,000 daily interdependencies, would hold forever. Turns out, sometimes what looks like strength is really just inertia, waiting for one heavy blow to tear it all apart. It was late September, still muggy in East Texas, the kind of sticky heat that lingers after a heavy rain. Business at Johnson & Sons was good. The mood in the company was optimistic, and Dad had begun letting me make bigger decisions, trusting my judgment. Ben, my older brother, had recently returned to the fold after years of drifting in and out of family business affairs. My guard was, well, not down, but maybe I'd stopped looking over my shoulder so closely. I never expected that my world could tilt so fast and so far from one afternoon to the next. It started innocently enough, an emergency meeting with the board that I found out about only minutes before it was scheduled. The air in the conference room was colder than the blasting AC. My father sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, looking pale and tired in the fluorescent lights. The head of the board, a man who'd championed my father's career for decades, slid a folder across the table with the kind of careful resignation reserved for bad news. Inside were a series of financial statements, correspondence logs, and transfer authorizations. It all looked like standard company paperwork, until I noticed what they were really saying. They were accusing my father of manipulating numbers, misstating earnings, disguising losses, unauthorized transfers from company accounts. My heart turned to ice. This wasn't just a business crisis. This was scorched earth. My father's reputation, 30-plus years, at stake. In small towns, scandals don't stay contained. They infect friendships, fracture years of trust, drive people into corners. In that room, I watched my father's world shrink and stiffen. He said little, his jaw tight, his hands steady but pale. "These are serious allegations," the chairman said, refusing to meet his gaze. Ben spoke first. He read in a clipped, almost rehearsed voice. "The board has no choice but to ask Charles Johnson to step aside, pending an independent audit and a full review. The company's standing and credibility are paramount." His words hung in the air like a slap. I felt the insult stain me as much as my dad. I wanted to scream. Instead, I was silent, watching Ben, my brother, refuse even to look our way. The meeting broke, and just like that, Dad was out. He walked out of the office that day, a fundamentally changed man. His broad shoulders seemed to stoop in defeat. At home, the anxious hush settled. My mother baked compulsively. I answered the phone, fielded reporters, tried to keep the staff calm, all the while burning with a sick combination of fear and fury. I couldn't understand why Ben had orchestrated this. Did he believe the rumors? Or was there something darker beneath? Jealousy for Dad's faith in me, anger that he hadn't been chosen to lead. Family secrets churn under the surface, and nobody wanted to admit what we all feared, that some trusting part of our hearts had been naive. The days turned into weeks of quiet, punctuated only by headlines and whispers. Staff tiptoed about, half apologizing with their eyes. Board members stopped returning my calls. The only constant was the gnawing sensation that something about the accusations didn't add up. I'd been handed spreadsheets and memos, but the story behind them felt crooked, full of forced connections and gaping holes. Dad swore he didn't do it, not in anger or self-pity, just exhausted certainty. If I knew anything about my father, it was that lying never sat on him comfortably. Watching him diminished and shuttered was agony. At night, insomnia took root. I'd sit in Dad's old office, staring at the backlit screens, scrolling through years of electronic records, digging for meaning beneath the numbers. The deeper I looked, the more confused I became. Discrepancies were there, obvious to any outsider. Yet, patterns emerged. Approvals were perfectly forged. Email threads cut off at strange intervals. Reference numbers out of sequence. And authorization signatures. They looked right, but if you magnified them, little details were off. I grew suspicious, not just of Ben, but of how seamlessly the evidence had been assembled. The hardest part was the loneliness. My mother hovered, wanting desperately to believe everything would resolve itself with time and some Texas brand optimism. Dad sat slumped in the breakfast nook, counting the hours until, what? Vindication or the loss of everything he'd built? Even the house felt smaller. At the company, old friends I'd thought of as honorary uncles became stiff, polite, and then distant. What kept me sane was the certainty that if I didn't fight, nobody else would. Protect the family, Dad's old words echoed. But this time, it meant protecting him from his own flesh and blood. I called in every favor, quietly asking our IT analyst to pull every accessed log, I compared writing samples, traced login locations. Over weeks, I built a case so methodical that emotion had no room to breathe. I didn't allow myself to grieve or rage. I became colder, more focused than I'd ever thought possible. If Ben thought he could just watch our father fall, if he believed nobody would see through the smoke and mirrors, well, he hadn't counted on how stubborn a Johnson can be. And so, every night, I pieced together email chains and digital breadcrumbs. One afternoon in mid-October, a breakthrough. Metadata revealing files, modified from Ben's home computer at odd hours. A series of authorizations, signed with Dad's signature, but drafted from Ben's secure company account. It all came together in a sickening, airtight puzzle. I chronicled everything, step by cautious step, not letting my anger show. I knew that to expose the truth, I couldn't make it about vengeance. I needed facts, unassailable and unemotional. Meanwhile, the family felt the strain. Mom and Dad barely spoke at dinner. I caught them both crying, separately, never together. I didn't know whether confronting Ben was worth it. Would the damage be permanent? Was I about to destroy the family for good? Late one night, I decided, some wounds are necessary. Protecting my father and the company meant risking everything else. Even love for my brother, even childhood memories, or the illusion of an unbreakable clan. The story, the true one, not the boardroom version, was ready for daylight. Exposing it would mean taking on the same people who'd once been my mentors, friends, and confidants. And so, with evidence marshaled and nerves steeled, I prepared to not just save my father, but end a kind of innocence I'd never get back. The uncompromising decision. I wish I could say the moment I made up my mind was cinematic. Some stormy night with a flash of insight, like in the movies. In reality, it happened at 2 a.m. in my cluttered home office. I was bleary-eyed, a cold mug of coffee in hand, and a spreadsheet open in front of me. For days, worry and anger had warred in my head, but now there was only a flat, rational focus. My father's legacy was on the line, and nobody, especially not my own brother, was going to take it from us without a fight. I started by drawing up a list. Every suspicious transaction, every irregular approval, every document that didn't sit right with me. I cross-referenced timestamps and login locations, hunting for inconsistencies. My training, first in business school, then in Dad's store, served me well. I knew the system's quirks, the patterns of behavior my father followed that nobody else would spot. Slowly, methodically, the pieces started to fall into place. Privacy and trust were no longer luxuries. I stopped tiptoeing around Adam, stopped avoiding painful questions. I studied scanned signatures, compared email metadata, looked for drafts left in odd folders. Every clue, every anomaly, I documented in a secret file. There was nothing sentimental about my approach. Each day, I became less sister, more investigator. Each interaction with Adam was now a game of poker. I kept my tone neutral, asked leading questions, listened for the hesitation in his voice. When he approached me about moving on or suggested I take a long overdue vacation, it only made me more vigilant. I confided in just one person outside the family, our longtime IT specialist, Tony Nguyen, a soft-spoken man who'd maintained the company's digital backbone since floppy disks were cutting edge. With Tony's help and discretion, we checked digital trails, login histories, email access logs, print queues. Our findings were chilling. Files moved from Adam's office late at night. Drafts of incriminating documents saved under strange file names. Emails sent from my father's account at hours. I knew my father was asleep. I gathered handwriting samples for comparison. My father's, Adam's, and my own. and paid for a forensic handwriting expert to look at the authorization forms. The verdict, many signatures allegedly made by my father, bore telltale signs of being copied, not signed. Microscopic hesitations in pen strokes, pressure points inconsistent with him. Emotionally, the process hollowed me out. At home, Mom asked if I could let it go, if maybe the truth would come out eventually. But that's not how the world works. Certainly not in business, and especially not in a small town where first impressions stick. I explained to her that if Dad's name weren't cleared soon, there would be nothing left to salvage. She quietly stopped asking after that, her way of letting me know that she understood, even if it hurt to see her family split apart. My resolve was absolute. This was a betrayal so personal, so entwined with love and obligation, that the only way through was cold, methodical proof. The truth had to be laid bare, no matter the cost to family harmony or fond memories. The more evidence I found, the more determined I became. There was no going easy on Adam, no softening the blow for the sake of the past. I realized, bitterly, that sometimes the deepest loyalty you can show is to the truth itself, even when it means exposing someone you once loved unconditionally. I didn't cry. I couldn't afford to. Not when the stakes were a reputation, a legacy, and the hard work of 3 generations. In those weeks, our house felt colder than ever. Family dinners were awkward silences and polite refusals. Dad spent more time out back, walking the property line, shoulders sagging a little more each sunset. But that pressure, those silent, expectant glances from neighbors, the weight of my father's faith, transformed relentless fear into a stubborn courage I never knew I possessed. And so, every day, I sifted through data, forged ahead with interviews, pushed Tony for more logs, and checked and rechecked every lead. I was no longer just Jessica Johnson, daughter and manager. I was judge, jury, and, for Adam, potentially his worst nightmare. In business and in blood, someone had to defend what mattered, and I'd decided I would do it, no matter the cost. The dangerous game and the decisive evidence. From the day I committed to exposing my brother, every minute felt like playing chess in a thunderstorm. I wasn't just fighting for my father. I was fighting for the heart of everything I'd grown up believing about right and wrong, family and betrayal. The stakes were visceral: friendships, family dinners, our livelihood, and the silent weight of my father's reputation in Cedar Creek. This was no ordinary office squabble. It was a slow, suffocating duel where every move had to be planned with the coldest precision. Yet every plan was colored by heartbreak. The first hurdle was operating in the shadows. Johnson & Sons was built on trust. People left office doors unlocked, shared sticky notes with passwords, and filled the break room with half-eaten pies and overheard secrets. Suddenly, I had to become someone I barely recognized. Evasive, alert, quietly paranoid. After all, snooping on your own brother wasn't just uncomfortable, it felt like trespassing in sacred territory. I began storing notes in coded files, locking my laptop, double-checking for eavesdroppers before making even innocent phone calls. I kept my feelings close and my suspicions closer. Still, collecting evidence was like peeling the skin off a stubborn fruit. Ben knew the system. Even if he had set me up, he was clever enough to cover his tracks. I knew I needed hard proof, not gut instinct. So I charted a course between digital forensics, human observation, and old-fashioned detective work. Every night, after work, when the parking lot was empty and the hum of the central air echoed in the halls, I'd log into the network and meticulously review logs. I looked for login patterns, who accessed sensitive files, when, and from where. I documented last modified dates, flagged files that had been moved, and tracked down draft documents that didn't match official records. Our IT specialist, Tony Nguyen, became my reluctant partner in this clandestine operation. What I appreciated most about Tony was that he didn't ask questions. He'd seen enough family politics to keep his head down, but had enough loyalty to Dad, and maybe to me, to help anyway. Tony showed me hidden audit trails in the file servers that even Ben might have overlooked, like auto-saved backup versions left on obscure partitions. Sometimes the data felt like a cryptic puzzle. Why would Ben save signed forms twice? Why the discrepancies in file sizes between versions? Together, we reconstructed timelines down to the minute. Who logged in, which terminal or remote device they used, what files were accessed, and when. But the digital trail wasn't everything. Forgery in a small business can be as physical as it is virtual. I obsessively collected paper trails too. Print logs, scans of invoices and approvals, even the carbon paper copies from delivery receipts. Once, I nearly choked up cleaning out the storage closet and finding stacks of old ledgers Dad had kept just in case, as if he'd known, deep down, that the past could one day be the difference between ruin and redemption. For weeks, my life devolved into a seesaw of anxiety and adrenaline. Days I'd spend in the office playing the dutiful daughter, managing operations, shuffling orders, and keeping up the illusion that everything was business as usual. By night, I transformed into an amateur sleuth. My house became a war room of sticky notes, screenshots, hand-drawn timelines, and folders filled with comparisons of signatures or handwriting samples. I bought a forensic magnifier and spent hours comparing every questionable signature. Dad's looping script versus the subtle tremors in what now I suspected were carefully reproduced fakes. I began to notice Ben's subtle shifts. He'd started watching me during meetings, asking offhand questions about my schedule, and sometimes I'd find my office door slightly ajar when I knew I'd locked it. The paranoia wasn't just from sleepless nights. It was a palpable, crawling presence that made me jump at every unexpected email or phone call. Still, anger made a strong antidote for fear. I kept my mouth shut, letting suspicion fester in silence, knowing that if I moved too soon, I'd lose the element of surprise. The real break came on a Saturday morning. Company policy was never to process high-value transfers on weekends, but as I was cross-referencing digital approvals, I found a single authorization processed at 2:37 a.m. The signature was Dad's, but Dad was with me at home that entire night, sleepless, pacing, grieving the limbo his life had become. The request originated from an IP address registered to Ben's home Wi-Fi. My pulse hammered as I realized this was the keystone, a verifiable digital footprint, an unshakable connection. From there, the pieces tumbled. With Tony's technical muscle, we uncovered a series of emails drafted in Dad's name, but sent from Ben's workstation. Emails to suppliers, banks, and internal auditors, all perfectly crafted to sound like my father, but full of subtle errors only a family member would spot. Wrong turn of phrase here, a date my father would never forget, mistyped there. Bit by bit, a glaring pattern revealed itself. Ben, using my father's trust and authority, had orchestrated a campaign to shift blame and maneuver company finances to his own benefit. Maybe the hardest part was not confronting him right away. But this wasn't a soap opera. I couldn't storm into his office, brandishing files. I built my evidence, securing every link in the chain. I researched state laws about corporate fraud, and started drafting an airtight report with Tony, documenting every digital signature, every odd-minute login, every faked email with accompanying timestamps and IP logs. I even video recorded myself reconstructing the findings, a how-to reel for future auditors, but also, I guess, for my own sanity. Meanwhile, the pressure at home mounted. Mom was a shell of herself, going through motions, still setting the table for family meals that nobody enjoyed. Dad tried to keep up appearances, but mostly drifted outside, sitting on the back steps for hours, clutching his old work cap. The isolation gnawed at me, but it steeled my resolve. What was the point of family, if not to protect what was right? Work at Johnson & Sons took on a surreal edge, as though the whole staff was holding its breath. Rumors flared, and a few trusted old-timers quietly hinted that they believed in Dad, that something didn't feel right about the sudden accusations. The perfectly damning documents. Their silent support gave me hope, even as I operated in secrecy. The final puzzle was psychological. I had to learn Ben's habits, his rhythms, the way he phrased excuses, and the small tells in his demeanor. I replayed in my mind every conversation, every sideways glance. I made a list of triggers, topics he avoided, moments when his resolve seemed shaky. In a strange way, it was forensic psychology meets sibling rivalry, coming face to face with the scope of his betrayal, hurt in ways I have no words for. This was my brother, the person who taught me to ride a bike, cheered me on at spelling bees, ribbed me at Thanksgiving dinner. Yet there he was, caught not by one disastrous blunder, but by 1,000 tiny cracks in his armor, small enough to hide. But not so small, I'd miss them once I knew where to look. Evidence finally in hand. I found myself standing at another impossible crossroads. What to do once the truth was no longer just mine to bear. But before any public showdown, I made sure Dad saw the proof first. We sat together late into the night, going over each file, each note, in agonizing detail. There were no outbursts, only a profound sadness and a tightening resolve. "You did the right thing," Dad said quietly, voice hoarse, "no matter what it costs." I realized then that all the danger, the heartbreak, the months of sleepless obsession, none of it was just about the business. It was about refusing to let lies define who we were. It was about fighting for the truth, for the dignity of past and future Johnsons, who deserved better than shadows and secrets. So I prepared for the next move. I calendared a meeting with the board, secured copies of all evidence in triplicate, rehearsed answers to questions that would come as much from a place of shock as from suspicion. I wasn't just exposing Ben. I was exposing every weak spot in the myth of infallible family loyalty. And deep down, through all the exhaustion and betrayal, I found clarity. The dangerous game was nearly over. And for the first time, I knew who I was willing to be when everything else was stripped away. Not just my father's defender, or the fixer in our family saga, but someone brave enough to tell the truth, even when the world wasn't ready to hear it. The cold reprisal. When I look back, there's a strange clarity to those final days. The part of the story that hardens a person forever. My relentless quest for the truth had brought me to a threshold, and I knew there was no poetic way to end things. It was war. If my brother's betrayal felt like a knife in the back, what came next was the cold, surgical act of taking back control. The rest of the world saw this as a business crisis. To me, it was the slow, breathless execution of justice. And for once, I couldn't let emotion soften the edges. I spent days compiling the evidence. I wanted everything, every digital trail, every forged signature, every file and photograph, sorted and bulletproof. There could be no holes, no doubts. The report was meticulously organized, cross-referenced, indexed, and triple-checked. Tony, our IT specialist, helped me encrypt files and secure physical folders in a sequestered lockbox, away from prying eyes. Tony became my unlikely co-conspirator. Always calm, always methodical, his quiet presence somehow grounding in a house swirling with emotion and suspicion. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. The company's quarterly board meeting approached, and with it, my opportunity to bring everything to light. I'll never forget that morning. How I dressed in neutral colors, my hands trembling only when I was out of sight. I remember the familiar scent of scalding coffee, the distant hum of the hardware trucks, the pulse at the base of my throat that wouldn't calm. I arrived early, my evidence packed neatly in a steel briefcase, accompanied by encrypted USBs, a timeline printed in full color, and annotated copies of every key document. I even brought a witness statement from Tony, just in case anyone tried to paint me as a woman bent on vengeance rather than truth. The boardroom was chilly and impersonal. Marble-top table shining beneath clinical fluorescent lights. My father was there, hunched and pale, but resolute. Ben, now my adversary, sat across from me, attempting a mask of composure, but betraying himself with tapping fingers and darting glances. The other board members arrived in a hush, their smiles tight, the tension thick as syrup. I forced myself to breathe slowly. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. I started my presentation with the calm of someone reciting facts, not accusations. I drew a clear line between personal pain and professional protocol. For each incident, I laid out a digital trail, a scanned signature, a forensic report, or a set of security logs. I explained login timestamps, geolocation records, access anomalies. For every claim, I offered documentation, cross-referenced and verified by Tony or a trusted third party. Silently, I watched my brother's face shift from derision to discomfort, then to denial. But facts have a weight that even the slickest performers can't shake. For the first time, Ben truly had nothing to say. The silence in the boardroom after my 2-hour presentation was deafening. I knew, my father knew, if the look in his tired eyes was any measure, that the world had shifted. I gave copies of the full report to each board member, made my closing statement about the company's reputation and our family's integrity, and sat back. I felt raw, as if I'd been skinned alive, but at the same time, there was a steely thread of satisfaction running through me. The reaction was methodical. First, the board voted to suspend Ben pending a deeper investigation. Second, the company's attorneys were notified to initiate internal proceedings. But I'd anticipated what would come next, a public storm. When it happens in small communities, scandal isn't content to simmer quietly. It boils over. The board, wishing to avoid any perception of a cover-up, recommended and ultimately approved referring the matter to law enforcement. My brother was removed from office and placed on indefinite leave the moment the meeting adjourned. I remember returning home that day. The air outside felt sharper, the sunlight too bright. My mother received the news in quiet tears. My father sat stoically, acknowledging my actions with a single, wordless nod. We weren't celebrating. There was no music, no relief, only the cold realization that we'd waged war against one of our own, and inevitably, there were losses on every side. My childhood memories now bore the stain of those weeks. Yet, beneath the ache, I felt something tougher than pride, the absolute certainty that this was the only way to cleanse the wound. Fallout arrived in waves. The community buzzed, Gossip spreading from Sunday sermons to hardware store counters to Rotary Club meetings. Friends and former confidants shifted, some rallying to our side, others keeping their distance as if betrayal might be contagious. My brother's legal troubles mounted. An internal audit substantiated my findings, and county investigators moved swiftly. I tried not to gloat, even in private. But each hearing, each headline reaffirmed that the fight for truth had been worth it, even as it cost us the illusion of unity. As the dust settled, I was left to steady the business and, more dauntingly, the family. Johnson & Sons slowly regained credibility. Vendors who'd kept us at arm's length returned. Old employees who had nearly quit now volunteered for overtime. And customers greeted us with cautious optimism. My father's name was publicly cleared. The pain didn't vanish, but the shame did. The family dinners were smaller, quieter, touched with loss, but what remained was real. What surprised me most about this cold reprisal was how fundamentally it changed my sense of self. I had crossed the Rubicon. I was no longer simply the dutiful daughter or the talented manager. I was the one who enforced the values that had for so long been only spoken about in vague, pious terms. I anchored a new chapter of the family story, one where loyalty did not mean blind allegiance, but principled, sometimes painful, action. There were moments when I doubted whether the cost had been too great. My relationship with Ben was beyond repair. My mother, resilient but changed by grief, now looked at her children with a clouded gaze. My father and I, united in defense, silently mourned the sibling we'd lost, not to physical distance, but to the irreparable divide of betrayal and truth. And yet, somewhere in those quiet moments after the storm, I found indomitable strength.
Emily.
My sense of justice had become my North Star, guiding me out from under the long shadow of my brother's ambition and into something like daylight. If I learned anything during that cold confrontation, it's that sometimes mercy is cruel, while justice is clean. In delivering that reprisal, I saved what mattered most. Even as I lost things I'd once thought irreplaceable, and though my hands trembled that day, though they sometimes still do, I can look back knowing I acted not just for myself or my father, but for every truth that deserves its place in the light, no matter how cold it's coming. Lessons on trust and family. If you'd asked the younger version of me, back when Cedar Creek still felt as safe as a song, and our family dinners were full of laughter, what I thought family meant, I would have rattled off something trite about loyalty and togetherness. I would have told you that family is the one thing that never falters, a safety net knit so tight that even the sharpest disappointments bounce right off it. That was before trust became something fragile, before I learned that sometimes family is where the hardest, most wrenching lessons are forged. In the months that followed the unraveling of our family's business drama, I found myself wandering familiar old paths, both in the company and inside my own head. Johnson & Sons took on a different energy after the storm had passed, humming with a mix of cautious hope and undeniable loss. The employees who'd whispered in quiet corners now greeted us with tentative faith. Our customers, loyal but wary, returned with a guarded optimism. And my father, freed from the ugly shadow of suspicion, stepped back into his role with the dignity that belonged to him all along, but with a new sadness about him, a wariness I'd come to recognize in myself. I will admit, rebuilding was not a clean or linear process. Some mornings I woke up with a sense of determination, the kind that came from knowing I'd chosen the hard right thing, not the easy wrong. Other days, grief howled in me. For the brother who'd fallen so far from the person I thought I knew. For my mother's lost sense of peace. For the childhood belief that loved ones are always safe from harm. Our family dinners were quieter, sometimes silent, the gaps between us echoing as loudly as words ever could. It's hard to understand what you've lost when what's gone is not a person, but your entire way of belonging to each other. Looking back now, with time smoothing a few of the sharpest edges, I see that trust is not an endless well. It's finite, and once broken, refilling it takes more time and work than I ever imagined. There were days I wanted desperately to forgive and forget, to wave a magic wand and return us all to those easier times. But forgiveness, I learned, is not the same as willful naivety. It is an active choice you make over and over, sometimes without the comfort of mutual repair. Some people in town expected our family to splinter for good. There was gossip, of course, rumors that I had ruined the Johnson name, that maybe I'd acted for ambition rather than truth. Others, the ones who had watched the story unfold with quiet sympathy, came forward with stories of their own, confessions about betrayals, regrets left unspoken at their own family tables. It was then that I realized how universal these wounds are, that the pain of family betrayal is as old as family itself. I also came to understand that you cannot fix a fracture by pretending it does not exist. There were awkward attempts at reconciliation, Ben sending cards at the holidays, Mom writing long letters that never seemed to say quite what she wanted. Dad tried once to reach out, his carefully written email formal and trembling, with a hope he would never admit aloud. In truth, I'd spent so long fighting to defend him that I'd all but run out of energy for anything beyond survival. We spoke of Ben sometimes, but only briefly and always with a kind of formal sorrow. Time passed, and with it, the realization grew that forgiveness would not come with a grand gesture, but perhaps with small acts of grace. I started picking up the phone when Ben called, at least to listen. Mom set a place for him at Thanksgiving, even if it sat empty. Dad left the porch light on late, in case Ben ever came back home. Perhaps the greatest lesson was this: loyalty, real loyalty, does not ask you to lie or turn a blind eye to wrongdoing. It asks you to remain standing through the reckoning. I carried enormous guilt for exposing what I did, afraid that my pursuit of justice had demolished any hope for reunification. Yet, in honest moments, I knew that to have pretended nothing happened would have been a different and deeper betrayal. To myself, to my father, to every notion of right we'd ever been taught. Trust survives, not in the shelter of denial, but in the sunlight of hard truths. I watched as Dad, though hurt beyond words, refused to become hardened or embittered. He thanked employees for staying the course, generously forgave those who had doubted him, and never once spoke ill of Ben in public, though I knew he sometimes mourned in private. Mom, in her quiet way, began volunteering at the local church, channeling her heartbreak into gentle acts of service. Even I, for all my bravado, found that leading the company after such a public schism demanded more humility than pride. There were days when I ached to run away, to leave Cedar Creek behind, start somewhere anonymous and clean. But roots, once grown deep, are not easily untangled. Beyond Johnson and Sons, the crisis reshaped how I saw the world. I became more cautious with people's intentions, wary of trusting too quickly. But that wariness also meant I was learning to define boundaries, the emotional guardrails that keep you safe without shutting everyone out. The experience forced me to grapple with forgiveness in the real, practical sense, not just as a lofty idea, but as a daily practice, choosing to live forward rather than backward. My relationship with my father grew, strangely enough, into something deeper and more equal, where once I'd seen him as infallible, a living legend in the business and in our family. Now I saw him as painfully human. Our conversations grew longer, sometimes filled with silence, but always marked by respect and gratitude. Dad was never the same, nor was I. We learned together that what binds a family isn't perfection, but the battered, sometimes threadbare act of continuing. He trusted me with more of the company, and, more importantly, with more of himself. The worries, the stories he'd never told, even the mistakes. As for Ben, I still hope that one day the distance between us might narrow. I don't know if trust, once shattered, can ever be fully mended, but I do believe people can choose to change. Perhaps that is the heart of family, not the guarantee that we'll always get it right, but the chance, however fragile, to forgive, to try again, to love in spite of the scar tissue. In the time since, when new challenges arise, economic downturns, unexpected competition, family health scares, I find myself less rattled, more anchored. I've survived the hardest betrayal I could imagine, and from that crucible, I carry a different kind of resilience. I don't flinch from difficult conversations. I insist on transparency, even when it stings, and I never, ever take trust for granted. I know what it means to earn it, to lose it, and to rebuild in its absence. If I could speak to others wandering through some valley of family betrayal, I'd tell them, it's okay to hurt, to rage, to grieve, but it's also possible to heal. You will never have the family you once thought you did, but you might discover one that's truer. Hold fast to the values that matter, and remember that courage sometimes looks like demanding the truth. Other times, it's simply opening your door, literally or metaphorically, when the past comes knocking, even if you're not ready to let it in. In the end, our story is not one of perfect resolution or cinematic reconciliation. We're still a family, though differently shaped. My father and I continue to run Johnson & Sons, the scars of what happened running deep, but not defining us. We have our good days, times when the work flows easily, when laughter rises again around the dinner table, when a neighbor drops by with a fresh-picked pie and a word of encouragement. There are bad days, too, dark anniversaries, awkward holidays, or the ache that flares up when I catch sight of an old photograph of our family before everything changed. I have learned that trust, like any precious resource, is best guarded, but not hoarded, given carefully, but never withheld out of fear. If loving people means being vulnerable to loss, it also means being open to repair and renewal. My mother, for all her quiet suffering, once told me that family is less about blood and more about the choices we make each day to show up, even when it's hard. Dad agrees, in his own wordless way. A hand on my shoulder at the end of a long day, or a smile across the shop floor when I close a tough deal. What I know now that I could not have known before is this. We do not get to choose the trials life brings, but we do get to decide what we'll make of ourselves in their wake. The story of betrayal and hard-won justice in my family has changed me forever, tempered my optimism, but deepened my empathy, stripped away my illusions, but given me a clearer vision for what I want to build. I look at Johnson & Sons, at the lives woven through our company, the years of sweat and heartbreak, love and stubbornness, and I see both the cost and the worth of fighting for what matters. Family, I believe, is forged not by the absence of wounds, but by the presence of people who choose every day to try again. That is the lesson I carry, that trust is never simple, but it is always worth the work.